And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Radio Network. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio. Well, tonight is the first night of a couple of nights of programming where we're going to attempt to talk about, make sense of, explain, and hopefully eliminate some of the urban legends and myths surrounding something called RICAS. Now, anyone who's had kiddos for a significant period of time understands that standardized testing has been a political football that's been tossed around in Rhode Island, well, for generations, as long as there's been some form of standardized testing. After many fumbled attempts, we've arrived at something called RICAS, which is, a cousin to something called MCAS. And anyone who's lived on the borders I know and who's got a lot of friends in Massachusetts knows all about MCAS. Again, the emphasis over the next couple of days is to try and clear up the confusion. Editorial comment from station management, that's me. I continue to be frustrated with the inability of Rhode Island government to understand at some level that you just tell people the truth. Don't obfuscate, don't use word tracks, don't wordsmith, just tell folks the truth, because ultimately the reactions, the ideas, urban legends that folks come up with are often far worse than any of the momentary panics we may have with knowing the truth. We learned that lesson, maybe not, with regard to the entire COVID pandemic, where again, people, I don't know, what do we call splaining in government? Roadie-splaining, where you just tell us something because it fits your narrative as a politician, as a quote-unquote leader, and we don't trust you to begin with, and the more you talk, the less we believe you. So, and nowhere has that been more evident than in education. We suffer from highly challenged school systems in this state. And there are people doing a lot of good work to try and fix it, and then there's a lot of people who are just trying to maintain the status quo because of the sheer volume of money involved. Joining me tonight, again, is someone who is, at this point, well past being a repeat offender. Stephanie Muse is an educational activist. She is a leader in the safe school movement during the pandemic, during the COVID-19 era. And as a teacher and a mom, she has established herself as a rational source of information, an activist who is able to coalesce large groups of people, and has already left, despite really being an activist for just a year or two, it seems like, has already left her imprint, if you will, on the body politic of Rhode Island. Stephanie, thanks for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me again.
Well, it's everybody's asleep now, right?
Everybody's asleep now.
Except Stephanie, again.
My faithful dog, he's up with me still.
the work never ends. So this conversation got jump-started again between you and I this week, based on I received early in the morning from a friend in Cumberland a letter from a school superintendent. And we published that letter, and we'll continue to share that letter as sort of an original source document. It sends a markedly different signal, if you will, to parents about RICAS than, say, a video that was also supplied to me about the East Providence school system. You've seen both. And before we get into the weeds here, in a sense, why is there so much, you've got the East Providence school system, the Cumberland school system, two sizable school systems run by professionals, run by adults. Why is there a completely different take on RICAS?
So I was just as surprised to see that letter as you were, especially because so the East Providence School Committee meeting is from earlier in March. I think it's like March 9th or 10th. Mm-hmm. And around that same time, the Cumberland superintendent was actually one of the superintendents who was, I think he was interviewed by the Projo, and he had said basically, that the RICAS results aren't that helpful. He basically came out making a pretty strong statement against the usefulness of RICAS. And and I don't know if he explicitly said that families could opt out, but he questioned the necessity of forcing distance learning kids to go back to school, or really of any kid needing to take a standardized assessment this year. And then 3 weeks later, he's like, "Just kidding! It's mandatory. You have to send your child in." And it made me wonder, had the Rhode Island Superintendent's Organization met and been told something by the commissioner that made him change suit? Like, what is it that made him sort of do that 180 there? But yeah, definitely a different message. And the East Providence superintendent is still saying, we can't force families to come in, which is absolutely true. It would be insane to pretend that she could wield that kind of power. But yeah, East Providence is still maintaining that they can't force families to come in. They are obligated to give the test, and they can invite families in to take it. But that it is, of course, well within a family's right not to have their child take a standardized test any year, but especially this year.
So, and I think you've heard some of the conversations I've had with Angelica Infante Green, the Rhode Island Department of Education commissioner, when her language is, and let's try to be precise here. When confronted with a question about opting out of the test, she will tell you convincingly that there is no policy about opting out in the Rhode Island Department of Education. Now, you hear that as a parent versus you hear that as an educational activist. What does it say to you in each case? And parse those words for me if you could.
If I hear that as a parent and I hear that there is no policy, what I hear is that it's not an option. You can't opt your child out. It's not an option. Your child has to take this test. There's no policy that says otherwise. What it actually means is that even though Rhode Island has the opportunity to make a policy so that parents could opt out, Rhode Island has chosen not to make that policy to make it clear how parents could opt out. That doesn't mean that parents don't have that right. It just means that Rhode Island hasn't taken the steps to sort of like outline to make it easier for families to do so. And yeah, she's very careful in saying Rhode Island doesn't have a policy. That's not part of Rhode Island's plan this year. We're not having students opt out. She's even gone as far to say that students need a medical exemption or a letter from their doctor, which is, even if she believes that's true, there's nothing that the state could do to enforce families who just refuse to have their students take the test, even without a doctor's note.
Right.
That might be what she wishes would happen, but.
Well, we all have dreams. Many of them have been cruelly dashed, but we all have dreams. So the backdrop for tonight's brief conversation is chaos and confusion and misinformation. If that sounds like another day in Rhode Island, you're probably right. People finger pointing in all sorts of different directions. Now, what is standardized testing, and what is, generically speaking, RICAS? I mean, why are people? Why is this such a divisive issue in your opinion?
Oh my God. Standardized testing is like capitalism and education at its finest. We pay these giant testing corporations. I like I said, I think it's Pearson because Pearson does all of the standardized tests, but correct me if I'm wrong. But we pay these giant corporations to basically come in and hold our students and our educators accountable by doing this standardized measurement of what they've learned according to the Common Core standards for the entire year. And RICAS is Rhode Island's version of MCAS. Previously, it was PARC. And it's basically the yearly test that tests grades 3 to 8 to kind of give us a barometer, supposedly, on how education is going.
Why? And you talk about it being an extension of capitalism. We pay them an enormous amount of money. My understanding, too, though, is the true holy grail for them isn't not the short dollars, and I'm being facetious, that they receive for administering and monitoring this test, but the data becomes theirs as well, correct?
Like all of the student data,
right,
and demographic information. I would imagine so.
So it's a double barrel profit for them. They do this, and they've got a whole bunch of data to permanently mark it. Now, how long does it take for this test to be turned around, and how is it purportedly used to monitor our education?
Okay, so in a normal year, students test in spring, somewhere between March and May, and then the results are embargoed. It's like this whole thing. The results are embargoed but released to schools, not publicly, just for schools to use internally, usually around October, and then they're released publicly by the state sometime in late October, usually.
And at that point in time, how much of that information is disseminated down to the teacher level? I mean, how do you get to work with it, even though the children per se are not in your class anymore?
Yeah, so individual teachers, both through the Rides online portal and through the embargoed data that comes to school, it can be broken down by the classroom level. So I get to see information for my kids who I had the year prior, and I get to see information for my kids who are coming to me, are with me that current school year when I get it.
Right.
Which sounds not as helpful as it sounds.
Well, I was gonna say, what are some of the parameters that are worked on? How do you use it as a barometer? On a practical level, when your kiddos take this test in the next month or so, and you see it next fall, what's the protocol? What do you do?
Okay, so I will tell you what people could think theoretically could happen and then why it couldn't happen, right? So theoretically, this test has information about my students' reading, writing, and math and language scores. And theoretically, I could use that to plan curriculum, except that I'm not getting it until October, right? And the majority of my curriculum planning for the year happens even before the prior school year ends. So I'm planning forward for curriculum in June, July, August, not in October. And so we use other reading assessments. We use Fountas and Pinnell for reading, or we use different math assessments to get the information that we need when we actually need it, because RICAS is not turning that data around in a timely enough manner for anybody to use it except for the state. And so what that data is actually being used for in schools is for teachers to look at how their kids did as test takers, and then to plan how to make sure that they do better on that specific test the following year.
One of the great areas of controversy that surrounds the administration of this test is the notion of teaching to the test. Now, anytime I want to irritate the commissioner at one of these press conferences we go to, it's really easy, and I'm going to confess, because it's just you and me, right? It's a lot of fun, because I'll just work in there that I understand that you didn't have enough time to teach to the test. Do teachers, and I'm asking, we're painting with a very broad brush tonight, and this is not to be an indictment of teachers. Teachers are, in fact, the duct tape that holds together, obviously, this entire screwed up educational system that we have in this state. Were it not for teachers, we would have complete chaos. They would be, if students survive and thrive, it's because of the teachers, and it's despite the best efforts of administrators and the bazillions of consultants that seemingly pop up everywhere. So this is not meant to be an indictment of them whatsoever. But ultimately, what's the program here? Is there real value? Why are we doing this?
Okay, so yes, people absolutely teach to the test, and the reason why is because it's linked to funding. Supposedly not this year, and I don't know if that accountability waiver has actually been received by the state yet, but the accountability waiver would mean that the results of the test this year are not tied to a school's score that impacts funding that they receive federally, or how the state disseminates funding to them. But schools absolutely do teach to the test because it is tied to funding, and it is tied to these star ratings that the state gives to schools. And especially charters, which we know our commissioner loves. I will say that charters, more than any other brand of public school, definitely teach to the test. Our largest charter schools in Rhode Island, Achievement First, their entire curriculum is built around teaching to the test. And I know that Achievement First might hear that and argue back with me, and I'm happy to have that conversation. But their entire curriculum and way of being together is so much test prep. And that's definitely something that I don't believe that there's a charter school in Rhode Island or anywhere that isn't. Oh no, that's not true. That's not. No, I'm gonna take that back. There are many charter schools in Rhode Island who are definitely teaching to the test all year round, and then definitely when you get into like March, April, May, that's what kids are doing in school.
So, to me, this is the killer question, and again, so much confusion surrounds this. You're a teaching professional. You're very accomplished in the classroom as well as, if you will, the boardroom or the hearing room. How much of the test and teaching to the test is a productive method of educating young children, or does that in fact distract in the big picture you away from the skill sets that you're trying to impart to your students?
Okay, it is absolutely productive in that you can definitely change your test scores, right? You can definitely see improvement with your test scores if you teach to the test. Like even doing something as simple as having your kids take a practice test is shown to increase test scores. So yes, it's definitely productive in the way that you can teach the test. But if I frame it this way, it'll stop seeming so productive. So I can... right. So I've had students that I can think of who are reading well below what a grade level benchmark is, right? So I have fourth graders who are reading at maybe like a second or even end of first grade level, and will come back with with scores on RICAS that say that they are a level 3 proficiency, which is meeting the standard. So three is meeting the proficiency standard, 4 is exceeding, and then 1, 2 would be below. So I have students who are definitely not reading on grade level, but I've prepped them to take this test and they score proficient. Year after year, this happens. So it totally is productive in a way
Right.
to teach to the test, but it's definitely not productive like for students on like what's best for them level.
Right. So if it's, and you tell me, we've got a pretty good working relationship, which is a nice way of saying you can tell me when I'm overreaching here. So my takeaway is that while teaching to the test there is some element of proficiency, but a lot of that proficiency is in fact directed at being successful at the test. If you had your druthers in a perfect world, you would rather spend the entire academic year focusing on the curriculum that your school works with as well as your lesson plans and not have to deal with it at all. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Like I think my goal as a classroom teacher is to grow readers and writers and mathematicians. And I don't think that the word standardized has become such a dirty word, right? But like, I don't have anything against there being standardized assessments. Like we have to have ways as educators to measure student growth and progress. And we do have ways in schools and as educators to do that aren't RICAS and aren't expensive and don't take as much classroom time as RICAS does, and that we can like really turn around the results of those and have it impact instruction the next day, not 6 months later.
So then ultimately, there was legislation that succeeded No Child Left Behind. And it's my understanding that this testing, in a sense, is at some level tied to funding. And you have the classic example of mandates from the federal government. And the classic analogy is the 55 mile per hour speed limit. If you know, there are plenty of states where 55 miles an hour makes no sense whatsoever, but all sorts of highway and transportation funds were tied to, you know, driving 55, which of course spurred the all-time classic, I can't drive 55. But it's we can laugh about 55. We can't possibly, this year of all years, laugh about the impact this has had on education. You know, this is regardless of what school district, regardless of whether you're at a private, a public, a charter, a parochial school. You know, full disclosure, my wife is a teacher. This has been the most challenging year for her professionally in the very long time that she's been teaching. And I would imagine your experience reflects that at all. How appropriate is it in a year in which so much time has been lost because of the pandemic, and it's irrelevant at this point, the behaviors, the reasons for the purpose of this conversation, what they were. But how much precious time will be given up in preparing for these tests?
It's so this year, right? Like I'm not going to bend over backwards, and I don't think many teachers will be, to really do as much test prep as I normally would. And I don't mean like teaching to the test. I mean like literally just like showing my children how the tests work before they see it. I'm not going to spend as much time doing that because my school, and this is true for many schools, we just returned in person, right? So many schools in Rhode Island that haven't been open are just returning students back in the building, March, April, May. And right, so that's just not, when I'm prioritizing the things in the classroom right now, it's social emotional learning, it's like community building, and then reading, writing, and math. Like where have we left off? Where do I need to get you to before the end of the year? And testing, any time spent testing is taking away the precious little time that I have to do that.
There have been several states, Ohio included, I believe, that have taken the opportunity to, in addition to petitioning the federal government for the relaxation of the rating, if you will, standard, who have actually petitioned the federal government for this 1 year, just let's pass this year. Let's take a break, time out on the field, and let's just focus on making what we can of this school year. In your professional opinion, should Rhode Island have pursued that?
I mean, to be honest, I think it's a losing battle, right? And maybe it's not worth the commissioner's time to do that. I do think there's positive, like what message does that send to families? What message does that send to students about what you value? What message does that send to teachers about what you value? So yeah, it could have been a powerful way to send a message, but I don't necessarily think, I don't think any of those states have won that battle, and I don't think that any states are going to. I think every state is going to end up standardized testing this year. So I don't know if I were the commissioner, if that's a road that I would have taken. So I could understand her not pursuing that, but what I can't understand is not being transparent with families about what their rights actually are.
And let's get to that. Several rules are being conflated, and one of them is the 95% rule. And again, I done a little bit of reading on this, and please correct me if I'm wrong. The state is looking, the federal government, I'm saying, is looking for the state to ensure a 95% compliance with taking the test. Now, when that compliance falls below 95% on a pro rata share, the lowest marks will be added to the overall, if you will, snapshot of the state's performance. My understanding is that if right now, at least currently, there is no federal funding that's tied into that 95% per se. What you've got is perhaps a remix or an appropriate mixture of what schools are quote unquote performing and what schools are underperforming. Is there any limitation on the rights of a parent to simply say no?
No, so there's definitely nothing in ESSA. If anything, ESSA errs on the side of parents absolutely have the right to opt out for any reason. And if more than 5% of parents opt out, then it's on the state to figure out why those families opt out and to address it. And then the state becomes responsible for those low test scores in terms of accountability, which won't matter this year. But if 5% of families or more opt out, then the state is basically responsible for those zero scores. So the responsibility falls to the state, but nothing in ESSA or anywhere else says that parents are at all mandated to require their students to sit through these tests. And even if you homeschool your child, right, you have to have some way of assessing your child. But if you choose for that not to be standardized testing, you're allowed to say how else you're going to assess your child. And that's absolutely true and should be true for children who are not homeschooled too.
Right. And ESSA is something called the Every Student Succeeds Act, which, again, was the successor, if you will, to the No Child Left Behind. It's there's no money lost. There is perhaps a skewing of the numbers. But if in fact there is other methodologies, and by the way, folks, if you haven't had a chance to listen, in the post that we put forward, we've got a video, if you will, an excerpt. Now, it hasn't been edited. Its excerpt is contiguous. It has not been cut or sliced or diced in that respect. It's just a fraction of a very long school board meeting from East Providence, where literally in the case of the East Providence superintendent, she leads the two most vocal school district members literally through a question and answer that addresses everything we've just said. So, while I am not an expert, I literally try to play one on the radio. Stephanie is a teacher with considerable experience and has spent a lot of time as an activist in this area. And again, if that isn't good enough, and I understand people's cynicism and if you will, need to question, then listen to the video, because again, you've got a sitting, accomplished, well-regarded school superintendent pointing out exactly what the issues are. This is compounded, of course, by COVID. Now, we've talked about in the past, and I don't want to belabor this, but I feel like you give such a great elucidation of the realities, if you will, of life in the pod versus that which has been publicly attested to. How well have different schools, and you are involved with a group of people that spans over 15,000 people, and so there's a real cross-section of Rhode Island there. From your perspective, how well have schools adhered to the social distancing and the pod life that was supposed to be a day-to-day part of education in Rhode Island?
So I think I've said this before, but I don't think there's a school in Rhode Island that is still talking about pods, right? Because like from day one, kids' pods are broken by going home and being with their family members in other classrooms, by being on the bus, by walking home from school with kids in other classes. Like pods are, health, safety, theater at its very finest, I guess. Yeah. And then in terms of social distancing, that whole thing where like everybody was like, it's such a huge deal. The CDC has dropped the guidelines from 6 feet of distancing in school to 3 feet of distancing in school. Well, even when the CDC was saying 6 feet of distancing in school, RIDE's guidelines always said 3 feet when possible. So it really wasn't a big deal in Rhode Island because our guidelines never required 6 feet. They actually required 3 feet if you could swing it. And there are so many posts of Rhode Island teachers just posting pictures of their classrooms where literally students are like two feet away from each other, sitting all day. So both of those things have really, we can talk about them and we can write them into plans, but we can't make them happen in schools. We just can't.
Now, a number of parents have opted when the opportunity was available to go hybrid. Now, all of a sudden, those parents who, despite concerns and despite issues with the school's pod life, based probably on the reality of the assessments that organizations like yours were publishing, now they're being asked to drop them in the middle of the class, in the middle of the school, simply for these long-winded tests. How does that work within, again, this published framework where it's there's this crisis attached to mixing and matching children? Does it?
So I think some districts are trying. So like the Johnston's plan right now is to bring students who are home on the days when. So lots of schools are operating on a 4-day-a-week schedule. So like East Providence is, Johnston is, and they're planning on bringing. I don't know what East Providence is planning, but Johnston is planning on bringing distance learning students to school on the days when in-person learners are not in the building, to sort of like protect those pods. And, families I hate anecdotal evidence. I hate when somebody tells you one conversation that they had with a family and it's meant to make you feel a certain way. And there are probably lots of parents who have kids at home for distance learning that don't mind bringing their kids to school for testing. But there are definitely some families who have reached out to me, just saying like, I do not want my child to go to school. I have kept them home all year to keep them safe. And now I'm being told that it is mandatory. They have to go to school. Can you please help me? Right. And no parent should be feeling that way. And the idea that a school should just stop using the word mandatory for anything. Nothing is mandatory at school. Schools cannot force your child to do. There's literally nothing I can think of that schools can force your child to do. And it's really causing parents who have still really like well-founded fears about sending their kids into school buildings. It's really causing them some distress to keep hearing the commissioner kind of dance around this idea that it's mandatory, and to keep receiving these letters from their school districts that their child has to return in person to take this test.
Well, you've also got situations where you have family members who are in recovery or still heavily immunocompromised. I mean, you just do. It's sadly, it's a natural part of life that there are always going to be a number of folks who are suffering from cancer. They've just had surgery for a number of reasons. In addition to children's safety, there are reasons why these children have been kept home, kept away from their, and again, in a perfect world, we wouldn't be dealing with these concerns, but it's the real world. And, it impacts families in different ways. So to your point, and again, I listened to this East Providence school meeting, and then folks, take a minute and listen to the video, because it's stunning, the honesty, the simplicity, the common sense that took place in the space of about a 10-minute conversation. All the questions were answered. They were all dealt with a degree of a high level of teamwork, concern for everyone involved, equanimity, and just a can-do attitude. If you send your children to East Providence schools, I have to tell you, I'm highly impressed, because I listen to most of the meeting, with just the level of professionalism that they indicate. And then I go to Cumberland, and folks are getting an email when they wake up in the morning with, you will go to a school. And by the way, for the record, I've reached out 5 separate times to the Cumberland School District and to the gentleman in question, Mr. Mitchell. I've reached out to his office for comment on this. He has yet to return a call. I have a feeling that's my opinion personally, in conjunction with the type of attitude he maintained in that letter, which is to say, terrible. Now, let's get down to the last couple of minutes we have. And again, if you're just joining us, Stephanie Muse is with us. She's been a wonderful contributor to the coalition here. A great combination of professionalism, boots on the ground, a real teacher, a mom, all the ingredients to provide a really balanced perspective of what the real world is inside of a school right now. Something that parents, unless you're hyper involved in the school, particularly now in COVID, you don't get to see. You're really, there's a certain curtain that's drawn down on the process, and that's just part of life. That's part of being a parent in the year 2021. But quite frankly, school systems have not rushed to embrace, if you will, full disclosure, and what's the word for 2020? Transparency. So from your perspective, and I don't want to put you on the spot per se, but just from your reflections, if a parent wants to opt out, is it nothing more than sending a note to the principal saying, I'm opting out? They don't have to really provide anything, do they?
No. So the RIDE website says, and the commissioner maintains, that parents have to provide a medical note from a doctor that says that their child has a medical exemption for RICAS, which is ridiculous. But there are thousands of parents in Rhode Island who have opted their child out with no more than a letter to their principal, just saying, I'm refusing for my child to take the test. Please find other work for them to do during this time. And that's really all you need to say. And the commissioner can say that that's not policy or that doesn't happen. But the truth is that thousands of parents in Rhode Island opt out every year in that same way. And there's no reason why parents shouldn't be able to do it this year too.
And the final reflection, and again, the dreaded A word, anecdotal, but I've had a number of reports, which is the next nice word above anecdotal, right? When we don't try to specify how many, right? I've had a number of reports over the past few years from parents who, as a matter of course, opt out every year, that they're and I just love a reflection on this from your role as a teacher. The kids who are taking the test get snacks, chewing gum, literally in one case, an ice cream social, where the other children are put into breakfast club Literally, it seems like Breakfast Club. Watching a video where she had a film strip, right? Do they still have film strips? Watching a film strip or doing the most mundane activities. That to me, as an outsider, sounds childish. Compounding, if you will, the differentials or the differences or the barriers between kids who take and don't take. Why? I mean, have you seen that in the flesh? And why would schools do that? Or have you heard of that?
I definitely know that schools do, like, testing is so hard on kids. It's so hard, right? So like my school does a cookie celebration at the end of testing, or we give them like focusing candy while they work. They get to suck on Jolly Ranchers. And I think I don't think it's meant to be like, if you're not taking the test, you don't get the prize. I honestly think that it comes from a place of like, we know this is a really terrible thing that we're asking you to do today. So we're going to try and like make that feel better. But yeah, I could definitely see how it could get turned into like the kids who are not taking the test sit out and don't do anything. Honestly, if it were my kids and when my kids are of test taking age, I think that I will just keep them home and I won't send them in on testing days. If you've been in a school on a testing day, you know very little else happens. So these tests, they're timed to take 2 hours, but kids actually get unlimited time. Which means that the entire day is interrupted because you may have like 3 kids in your class who use that extended time and test until well after lunch, which means that you can't do anything instructional with just part of your class. Right. So it turns into like extra recess. Let's watch a movie. Let's maybe do a few read alouds, but your child is really not missing anything. So I think I would just opt to keep my kids home for those 3 or 4 days.
Well, again, thank you so much for the advice and the real world perspective, and your reflections as a teacher who's had to deal with this now for we're over a year as and I'm hoping I'm going to ask you to check back soon, if you will. Clearly now the first conversations are going to begin in the coming weeks about the next school year. And I'm going to be fascinated to see what the perspective is. It's the disease clearly isn't going away. On the other hand, you've got vaccinations, and I have no idea, and I don't know if anyone is how they're going to react to this and how they should react to it. So I'm grateful for your reflections and your insight, and I hope you'll join us again soon and just kind of keep us apprised. Sort of, you make a lot of challenging concepts and a lot of intimidating moments accessible to ordinary people. And for that, we're always grateful.
That's my job, right? 4th grade teacher.
Scruffy little varmints, right? That's outstanding. Stephanie Muse, again, joining us from the real world, educating us, informing us, and hopefully giving some comfort. Folks, if you've got questions for Stephanie, there's a number of social media outlets. But you can also communicate through us, send us questions. The Safe Schools social media movement is alive and well. I think if there's any upside to any of this is that there's an entire generation of parents who have now engaged and are not going to simply walk away or simply accept, the status quo or any of the narratives that are fed to them or attempt to be fed to them. I think there's a healthy cynicism, I'll say, out there where parents now understand that not only do they have the right, but they really have the responsibility for the benefit of their children to question everything. Folks, we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Radio Network at coalitionradionetwork.com, facebook.com/the Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio. Folks, we will be putting this into replay and putting this along with some supporting documentation on our website at coalitionradionetwork.com, probably in the wee hours of this evening. Again, feel free to reach out to us if you have questions of any of the folks who are going to join us. We will be on the air tomorrow night again to cover additional facets of this, as well as hopefully Thursday. So thank you for joining us. Stay tuned, by the way. I've got Keith Fernandez from the Rhode Island Apartment Association and also a group of real estate investors who regular folks, regular businesses, our friends, our neighbors who've got their own challenges during the COVID crisis. These are, again, members of our community, very often renting buildings, investing in our neighborhoods in a very personal way. And clearly, they've suffered too during this, and we're going to explore some of their concerns.